Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at Lund University. Remember, you can connect with us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all, thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be talking about how history can teach us more about when and why certain communication technologies become adopted for political purposes, whether that's political campaigning, whether that's social movements or interest groups. If we look back at the history of communication technologies, particularly in the United States, we'll start to see a pattern where a technology becomes introduced. Certain political actors start to play with that technology and test it out. When it's successful, others copy that. And then a new communication technology comes and kind of disrupts the entire cycle. And my guest today is Dr. Ben Epstein. He is an associate professor of political science at DePaul University. And we're going to be taking a deep dive into his book, The Only Constant is Change: Technology, Political Communication, and Innovation Over Time. It was published in 2018 by Oxford University Press. And I think for me, I really enjoy this book because it helps to contextualize and put into perspective that some of the rapid changes we're seeing now with digital technology have actually kind of happened before with the newspaper and the radio. So we're going to break that down. I think it's a great way to kind of step out of the hyper speed of social media development and different platform changes that are occurring every day. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Ben Epstein. Again, he's an associate professor of political science at DePaul University. Dr. Epstein, thanks so much for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's really an honor.
So before we dive into The Only Constant is Change, why don't we start out by discussing your interest in history more broadly? Because as you note in the book, there's a tremendous lack of using history to study political communication. So first, why do you think that is? And what inspired you to think about history when studying political actors' adoption of technology?
That's a great place to start. I've been thinking about history actually far longer than I've been thinking about political communication. So before I get into higher education, I was a high school history teacher, actually. And so I've been thinking about how to not only understand history, but how to communicate about it, how to make it relevant and tangible to students and to the broader public for a long time. And as I eventually moved over towards graduate school and teaching in higher education and eventually moving into political communication, I just saw this incredible connection between these amazing historical eras and historical changes and where we are today. And as I looked around, I just didn't see very much of that in other places. And I think that one of the reasons for that is because political communication and communication in general feels like it just constantly changes. There's always something new, and the new is usually exciting, and that's where a lot of the attention goes. And so there's a lot of focus on how new technology is changing where we are today, and less on how that connects to previous eras. And I'm excited to have been able to explore and dive into some of that.
Yeah, I think I've definitely been guilty of that myself. And it's one of the reasons why I thought the book was so interesting. And one of the reasons for why history can be a valuable tool when studying political media use is that, as you argue in the book, the goals of political actors are relatively stable over time. It's just that the activities used to accomplish these goals can change with technology. So can you unpack that dichotomy for us, the difference between goals and communication activities?
Sure, absolutely. I think that that's one of the most fundamental parts of the book. Really, is the just understanding the difference between some things that are so consistent over time and some things that understandably change all the time. So when we think about political communication goals, we think about what politicians or political organizations are trying to achieve through communication tools. And depending on what type of political organization you are or political actor you are probably going to have fairly similar goals to people that were in a similar position a generation or maybe several hundred years ago. If you're a politician, you ultimately want to win elections. So how do you use communication tools to reach out to people? Well, you're going to try to introduce yourself. You're going to try to talk about what's important to you, try to connect to potential voters, try to win over supporters, and then ultimately bring them out to vote or support you. And that's fundamentally how you're going to use communication tools today and the goal of using communication tools today and the same as it was 200 years ago. But obviously, the tools that are used, the actual strategies that are available, are so incredibly different. And so, while the goal might be similar, what you might have been doing in a stump speech 200 years ago, going from group to group, and then maybe something in a newspaper of some kind today is micro targeting using various social media platforms and is nuanced and technological, but the ultimate broad goal is the same. So we can compare similar types of goals using very different strategies, and I think that that's a useful lens through which we can explore changes and also some things that haven't changed very much.
Definitely. And I think precisely because those goals are so stable, we can kind of control for them when looking at when and why certain technologies become politically viable.
Right.
But it's not just the technologies themselves, right? You argue that history allows us to observe the political and behavioral forces that are also necessary for communication technologies to become viable. So, what type of political and behavioral forces influence political technology adoption? And could you perhaps give us an example of those forces at work?
Sure. I'm so glad you brought that up. I think that the technology is often the most exciting part for a lot of people and can sometimes become the focus. And the truth is that I think that, first of all, politics is always in the background or maybe in the forefront if you're talking about political communication. What are the political contours and structures in place and ultimately the political goals, but also the behavioral forces that are just there in general, like choosing individually or as an organization if and when and how you're going to innovate tools, if you're going to adopt something new. I think that if we just think about it personally, that's a really, really key part that has basically been entirely overlooked for the most part. If you think about, when your family first, I'm old enough to remember when we first got a VCR, or when you first got cable TV, or when you first got a cell phone, or you first got Wi-Fi at home, right? Any of these things are innovations that different families and different individuals chose to innovate at different points. And there are various factors that play into that. There's economic costs, and there's willingness to try something new, and there's the utility, the perceived utility of it, which I think is so important. And so when it comes to the combination of politics and behavioral forces, a big emphasis that I try to continually come back to in the book is trying to explore what might motivate an organization or a political actor to innovate their political communication tactics, their tools, their strategies, and what might not. What might lead them to say, no, what we're already doing is probably working pretty well. And so, on the political side of things, there's a fairly clear differentiation between political power players, people that are in power, people that are dominant in the current status quo, and those people that are more outsider. And essentially, they're not trying to keep things as they are, they're trying to bring up something new, trying to win an election when they otherwise might not necessarily be expected to. Maybe they're social movements or organizations that are trying to get their agenda on the national or international scene. And so they're more likely to innovate because they don't want to keep things the way that they are. So, and they have much less to lose if things change. So politically, they could see the opportunity to innovate as a much greater one and the risks being much lower. If you are a dominant player, the risks are potentially high because you can change your innovation style, you can change your communication style and suddenly not have that same success that you had previously. And so there are sort of political positions that can influence it, but behaviorally too, there's just a lot that goes into the decision about when an organization might choose to invest a lot of money to change how they do things or hire new and different people. And we can think about, political advertising as one very clear example that so much money is still spent on television ads for people running for office. And while that makes a lot of sense, there's also clear indications that you can be more effective and efficient using targeting on various social media or web-based platforms. It could be more efficient. It might even be more effective overall, but there are still sort of resistance by political organizations, by political campaigns to stop using TV advertising because they don't want to be the first ones to just not use it and then get blown out. So when you innovate, when you choose to hold on to what you've done before, there's a lot of political, personal, and behavioral calculations that play into that.
Definitely. And I think when we kind of take the long perspective, that gets us into this, the book's main theoretical contribution, which is the political communication cycle, or PCC. And you argue that by looking at American history, we can observe a kind of cyclical pattern where a technology becomes innovated, then it gets adopted by political actors, it stabilizes, and then there's a technological revolution that resets the cycle. So could you walk us through the PCC, and then later we'll get into some concrete examples that illustrate it?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, this political communication cycle is not only the theoretical foundation, but really provides the structure of the whole book. And it's the idea that we can observe long periods of relative stability. And these relatively stable periods are what I refer to as stable political communication orders. The order comes from American political development, which is a whole body of literature that I really have benefited a lot from and incorporate into my work a lot. And so this idea of a stable political communication order is when over a long period of time you have relative stability in how political messages are created, the relationship between political audiences and sources and messages, and ultimately those don't stay there forever. So you have this relative period of stability over what has often been a long period of time, and then that starts to become potentially disrupted. And the disruption happens when there's a major new technology, new information communication technology that's introduced. And a lot of these new technologies really never become anything, right? A few years ago, I remember people getting very excited about Google Glass.
Right.
Google Glass was going to like take over, right? And I have not seen or heard anything about Google Glass in a long time, which is a great example of something that could have taken off but didn't for a number of reasons. But occasionally there are these incredibly successful technological innovations that do take off, the radio being a great example, the internet broadly being another great example. And when these new technologies become widely used, when they become widely diffused through society, then political actors might start to see the political viability or the political utility of these new tools. And if they do, well, then it only makes sense that political actors are going to start to experiment or try to use some new tools to do what they've always wanted to do in the past, those sort of stable political goals, but they want to do them in a new, more efficient or more effective way. And usually those early innovations and experiments by political actors crash and burn. They usually are not successful at all, but they offer some trial and error and ability to learn what does and doesn't work. And over time, those trials become a little bit more successful. And ultimately, we can point to a few historical examples of highly successful uses of these new political communication tools. And when that happens, then other similar political organizations are going to try to model that. They're going to say, oh, it worked really well for this type of organization. We're trying to do similar things. So we're going to try to do the same sort of thing. And then ultimately, it can become, if they sort of recognize this political viability, then it can become more widely used through similar sorts of political organizations. And once that becomes eventually used as more or less the new status quo, then we can start to see a stabilization through regulation of these new processes, through institutions that can become created. And eventually that could become this new stable political communication order. So that whole process, the political communication cycle, is the revolutionary cycle that transitions from one stable order to the next. And as you pointed out, I sort of identify these four long-standing stable orders through history, and so much of the book is looking at what changes between them.
Yeah, because I think it's interesting. I mean, obviously, you look at the internet, you go, "Wow, amazing, transformative technology." But
Sure.
then when you put it in perspective with print, radio, and other medium, it's does follow kind of a similar pattern. So let's discuss some of those political communication orders. So you identify four of them. There's the elite PCO, the mass PCO, broadcast PCO, and information PCO. I'd like to kind of take some time and dive into each one because I think it does help contextualize kind of where we are today. So first, can we kind of recount the story, so to say, of the elite PCO and the mass PCO? Because those both relate to newspaper and take us back to colonial times.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've always been fascinated with early American history, and this book is rooted in and sort of exploring American political communication changes. But I'm excited that it's been applied to political communication change in other parts of the world, and so I'm very excited about that. But the book starts with American colonial era, and as you said, this early political communication order I call the elite political communication order because almost all, or really all, of political communication that was existing from the colonial era really through the early 18th century. All of that was either done in person through speeches, through stump speeches, through meeting people hand to hand, face to face, or it was through printed material, usually through newspapers. And the newspapers that were available at that time were almost entirely local. They were run by and for either business or political elites. And so that drove not only what was covered, but how it was covered.
And that's also because they were really expensive, right? I remember in the book
Really expensive.
talking about like the paper was made from like dried sheepskin or something.
Yeah, yeah. So early on, I mean, just the production of the newspaper itself, which is one of my favorite parts of the whole book, was just getting into the actual process of how these things were made, the actual physical manufacturing, which was incredibly dirty and dangerous in many cases, and just really, really time consuming and laborious. So it was really, really costly to make newspapers, and therefore it was costly to sell them. They were almost always sold on a monthly subscription basis, and almost by definition, that made it out of the reach of sort of the average colonial, citizen, or eventually citizen of the early United States. And that didn't really change until the mid 1830s, when we sort of shift from this elite political communication order where all of this printed material was done for an elite audience, to what we really can see as the first mass media in America, which is when print suddenly, for a number of reasons, but fairly quickly, became available and accessible to the mass public. And that's because of both changes in technology, that papers became much, much cheaper to print. There was better printing processes, there was better paper manufacturing, but also there was innovations in how they were sold. And for the first time in 1833, the New York Daily Sun started selling for 1 penny on the street corner instead of selling for a weekly or monthly subscription cost. And so for the very first time, you have what's called the penny press. And the penny press was available to anyone who literally could go to the street corner and buy it for 1 penny, and then probably share that with a lot of their neighbors or the people in there that they lived with, or people at the local bar or at the barber shop or wherever it might be. And so you suddenly have this mass communication that could reach a larger audience, and therefore the actual topics that were covered, the type of information that was covered, was going to change as well. And all of this is happening while at the same time, more and more Americans are able to access the political process, that you no longer needed to be wealthy to be able to vote. So while women and people of color still could not vote at this time, the class distinctions that were very rigid in the beginning of the American experience were no longer there. So politics was more accessible at the ballot box, and political communication and information was more accessible through these penny presses.
Right. And also, I think you talk about in the book how it's not just that these are, objective journalists writing about the news, right?
Right.
These were like arms of the political parties at the time.
Absolutely. Yeah, they were extensions, but for the most part, they were extensions of political parties. So we talk about this early era as the partisan press. And it's funny because today we often point to Fox News and MSNBC, and we talk about the op-ed section from the New York Times, and we talk about how various biases and ideological slants there are, and those become thrown around as if they are brand new, and they're not. In fact, there are far more objective sources of news today than there have been throughout almost all of American political history. And when we look back to that early era, new newspapers would form as extensions of the party. And often they would have them right in their title. They would be the Pittsburgh Democrat, or the Rockford Republican. I mean, they would be right there front and center. And it was an opportunity to not only spread political messages, but also to gain support and to gain readership, and to share political information of the day.
Yeah, it's interesting how the parallel between that and MSNBC and Fox is not particularly so new. But
Right.
I really got the impression that newspapers, and particularly the economy behind newspapers, was so integral to the formation of American politics. But it wasn't until the radio that we had the next kind of disruptive technology. What made the radio so disruptive?
Yeah, the radio is just so incredible when in terms of the changing the dynamic of our social makeup in this country. I mean, it was the first time where you could hear live, simultaneous information and entertainment from coast to coast. So where newspapers expanded and became easier to get and continued to increase in terms of readership, they were almost entirely locally based and they were focused on issues of an area. And for the most part, people lived, grew up, and died in a relatively close proximity to the same place. And so their worlds were very local, but the country was expanding, and radio for the first time allowed for a nationwide network of information to spread. And while only a little bit of that in the beginning was political or newsworthy at all, most of it was entertainment, it quickly became much more information based and more political. And the ability to use that to spread information or to try to link the country and to unify ideas around the nation in an immediate way and also in a more personal way was really dynamic. Hearing your leaders talk to you, especially during times of crisis, is far more personally meaningful than reading their speeches in the next day's newspaper. And it was hard to really be able to compare the difference when, people were talking about nostalgically these fireside chats, for instance, right? And that's such a dynamic change from reading George Washington's farewell address in the newspaper. It wasn't that one was better or worse, but it was far more personal, and because of that, more meaningful. And that's what the instant and, very tangible sense of listening to the radio brought to so many people.
Definitely. And I think it's interesting to kind of chart the adoption as you do in the book. I think the first radio campaign was in New York. It was a mayoral race.
Right.
And the reason being that, New York people could afford radios, even though, it was a new technology when not many people had it. It makes sense to do it in New York versus, let's say, somewhere in Kansas, because people in New York could actually afford the technology to be receivers of that information.
Yes, both because there were people that had the money to have them, but also it was just the concentration of people with access to a radio nearby. Because like the penny press, when there would be this newspaper that was bought and then shared to many other people, the radio was very much a communal event too, right? You could have one radio for a family or even for a whole apartment, and people would gather together and listen to this information. And because in New York City there was such a concentration of people all together packed in, this 1921 mayoral race was actually the first mayoral race in the country where over 1 million people voted. And that just shows how many people lived close by. And while they all did not have access to the radio, in fact, just a relatively small percentage of them did, enough of them had access that it motivated the two people running to try to use it for their campaigns. And, this is a great example of when the incentive to innovate is present. You mentioned mayoral race in Kansas. Well, you're right. There's no reason to do that when you might be able to reach a dozen people in 1921. But if you could reach, 10 or 20,000 people, and those people may be more likely to vote for you in a mayoral race, well, then that is worth at least trying, even though it was largely ignored at the time. It was sort of a botched effort for the most part and didn't really have any impact in the outcome of the election. The incentive to try this new technology was there. And it was before most people in the country had radios at all. I mean, that was early 1920s. By the end of that decade, the radio was in most homes around the country.
And one thing you emphasize quite a bit in the book, and I think you're right about, is that television did not mark a communication revolution, even though it's obviously been hugely influential in American politics. So why is it that politicians' use of television, which is a different medium from radio, doesn't kick off a new political communication order?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And actually, it's one that I was toying with and playing around with myself when I was working on the book for so long. I mean, I don't think any political medium has been focused on as much as television. And I think for many reasons that's appropriate. I think that TV is so important and so consequential to how we think about and relate to our political environment. But I think that it is in many ways an extension of the radio, because what the radio did was to entirely disrupt the form and the feeling and experience of getting political communication and what was available to political organizations and actors who wanted to reach the mass public. And they could do so quickly, instantly, and much more personally. And that, while it changed when you had video on television, that is fundamentally the same. You can still reach people quickly or immediately. You can still reach them personally. Image-based politics becomes increasingly more important as you shift from radio to television. But I think that these are sort of different tiers within the same broad political communication order. And to be honest, I paint with very broad historical brushes with this book, and I'm, really excited about how others are going to be exploring it and using it. And I think there's room for discussion and debate about this, but I see them as generally being much more similar and being sort of two parts of a broader, stable order that then is really fundamentally disrupted once we bring in the internet and then, as we've seen, what the internet has become.
Definitely, I agree because I think you can take a television ad, and you could just put it on the radio. It's not really
Yeah,
changing what the politician is doing or saying.
right. I mean, they're obviously different, right? I talk in my classes all the time about how Franklin Roosevelt, the only president who was elected more than twice, right, elected four times, was thought of as being this champion of using the radio. And he obviously suffered from polio his entire adult life. And I wonder how successful he would have been in a television era.
Hmm.
When people would see wrongfully, they may see his life in a wheelchair or using aids to stand up as some limitation on what they picture as a leader. And so they're different, but he was able to communicate and connect in a way through the radio in a similar way to how more recent politicians have been able to connect really directly and powerfully through their personal connection through the television. And so the timing matters, and they are definitely different. But I think that overall, the process and what it means for political communication is more or less the same.
Yeah, he also had a really nice voice. He must have practiced or something as well.
Oh, he totally practiced. He grew out of New York politics, and again, we talked about how New York was on the sort of cutting edge of incorporating radio into politics. So he was from New York and grew up using radio as a political tool way before he went into national politics. And so he had a great voice, but he also had practiced and figured out what worked and what didn't. It compares in some ways to the 1960 presidential televised debates, the first televised debates where you have John F. Kennedy, who was very knowledgeable on topics, but so was Richard Nixon. But Kennedy practiced in front of a camera. He tried on different ties. He wore makeup. And Richard Nixon thought, that's ridiculous, right? I'm just going to go up there and do my thing. And while maybe more is played up into the differences in how they actually did, it's about preparing for and thinking about the medium that you're going to use, which is just different than what was available before.
Definitely, definitely. So lastly, I think this would be the most obvious one for our listeners, is the internet kicking off the information PCO. So what makes these technologies revolutionary in respect to the prior PCOs? And when did this kind of information PCO focusing on the internet really start?
Sure. Well, in the book, I go through a longer history of sort of internet development and technological development. But when it comes to politics, it really emerged for the first time in the early to mid 1990s as more Americans started to get the internet at home. And we have the development of web browsers, early web browsers from at least from today's perspective that offered the ability for regular non-technologically sophisticated people that could afford a home computer to access some of this information. And so it really started to emerge in the mid 1990s, expanded through the late 1990s, and became much more technologically and politically sophisticated as you shift into the first decade of the new millennium. And you have changes in how political campaigns and political organizations are organizing, are using these tools, moving from very sort of traditional non-interactive, non-specific lists and sort of brochureware, as they're often called, into highly interactive, highly personal, and multi-platform based communication tools that we see today.
Yeah, and like with the radio and television, you put the internet and social media together in the same PCO. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on why social media didn't necessarily, mark its own political communication revolution.
Yeah, I wonder if 10 years from now or 20 years from now, if I revisit this theory, or hopefully other people will, that they might think about them differently. But I think that they're, at least right now, at least where we are today, there's no question that social media broadly and the individual platforms are incredibly powerful in a way that early web lists or message boards were not. But I do see them as fundamentally being connected. So all of these pieces together, all of this web-based communication compared to what existed before offers a number of clear and really seismic changes. They are immediately accessible. They are almost unlimited in terms of the volume of political content. So instead of getting the news on TV and eventually cable TV, now you suddenly have an overwhelming amount of political content all of the time. And it's also incredibly interactive, so much more interactive than any previous medium. And while social media is more interactive and is really based on user driven content in a way that maybe earlier internet communication wasn't as much, all internet communication is incredibly interactive. You had the ability to interact with the source of the information to create or modify your own political content and share that much easier than you ever had before. So you previously, really up until this era, you had a fairly static audience that then could communicate with themselves, but you had sources and you had audience. And now the blurring of the lines between who is a source and who is an audience of political communication, that changed dramatically and has accelerated in the era of social media, but I don't think is fundamentally different in terms of how that changes from what was available before the internet was widely used.
Right, right. I agree with that. So we've discussed some of the key technologies that have transformed political communication activities, but one of the most interesting elements of the book is to not only look at when technologies were successful, but also when they are not adopted by political actors. And in
Right.
the book, you discuss both the telephone and the telegraph, which were widely used in society, but not really picked up by political actors. So can you explain for us maybe why that is?
Yeah, it has to do with what is useful for regular everyday people and what might be different in terms of utility or perceived utility for political organizations or political actors. So, every individual is going to think about, if and when they want to get a cell phone, for instance, right? I remember in the book, there's a story of why I got my first cell phone. And I was motivated by what I thought I needed or didn't need in terms of when I made that change. For politics and for political organizations, those long-standing political communication goals are going to help guide them to determine if they want to start to look into innovating. And then they also have to figure out whether or not it's going to be cost effective. And both the telephone and the telegraph were not cost effective. First of all, they were extremely expensive for a very long period of time. And they were one-to-one communication. So both telephone and telegraph were, while there are some variations in how they eventually were used, they were primarily from one person sitting on one end writing or talking to someone on the other. And because they were so expensive, it was not a very efficient way to actually spread a political message to a large group of people. It was great if you wanted to target one particular person. But if I'm thinking about broad political communication goals, I'm generally trying to influence a large group of people to either introduce them to my position or to gain support or to gain resources or to in some way try to motivate some political action at the end. And that's going to be generally targeted towards a wide audience. And telegraph and telephone were both incredibly effective for business, for interpersonal communication, but because they were one-to-one sources of communication for most of history and expensive, they were not very efficient or effective choices for most political groups. And so they were widely used throughout society, but they weren't really integrated as a sort of fundamental change in political communication tools in the same way.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about how the telephone is used. I mean, we've seen campaigns that do phone banking and things like that.
Right?
But I'm thinking particularly of this election cycle with Elizabeth Warren calling, people who've donated to her campaign. But the
Yes,
reason she does that is because she can then put it on social media, right?
exactly.
So
Exactly.
kind of an interesting mix of technologies there.
Yeah, and what changes, I think, more recently is that while making calls is, I think Elizabeth Warren is the perfect example of that. Making calls is useful if you're going to be able to use that and broadcast it. And I thought that was used brilliantly by the Warren campaign. Every campaign offers the opportunity for you to text in your support. And then they can use the same tool, right, your cell phone now, to have sort of mass communication because they can send out a text blast, to hundreds of thousands of people at the same time in the same way that they previously had used email or could use an advertisement, except it doesn't cost them anything except the cost for sending a text message. And so that is one thing where it's changed, but in many ways it's using new technologies to do something not very new. It's just retrofitting it to a new form.
Exactly. So in the book, you talk about all these different technologies, but you sort of draw parallels between how campaigns use them, social movements, and interest groups, who each kind of broadly follow the same pattern in adopting these technologies, but they use different tactics and how they do so.
Right.
And one of the most interesting cases for me was how the civil rights movement didn't achieve their success by necessarily innovating with a new technology, but rather manipulating an existing one. So could you briefly describe that phenomenon, because it leads into my next question?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Brief background is that I've been interested in and teaching about the civil rights movement and social movements for decades, way before it's actually the reason I started to think about political communication, because I thought about not only thinking about the organizations and the movements themselves, but what sort of tools were they using. And so my interests over time shifted towards focusing on those tools and what is or is not similar over time. And in the book, I compare not only the civil rights movement and this broad lead up to it, but I also go in depth to the women's suffrage movement. And both of those are similar in that they created a ton of media. They had a ton of newspapers that were created to share their information, to spread the word, to gain supporters. And almost all of that, incredibly difficult and sometimes dangerous work was really sent to and received by people that were already affected and already supported those causes. So it didn't do a great job in and of itself, these innovations, of expanding the number of people who were supporting their causes. And that's largely due to just the difficulty of being a political outsider. And in the case of the civil rights movement, trying to win over powerful enough people at the state and the national level to change laws, to change policies, and to ultimately raise the awareness of these longstanding discriminatory practices that have been in place. And what ultimately happened at the end was that changes through media occurred not because of innovations by Black owned newspapers or Black owned radio stations, which basically didn't exist at the time, but it happened because of manipulation of media events. So using national and local press to cover stories that were going to very clearly show how protesters focusing on Birmingham, for instance, were, these kids in many cases were going to be attacked by a ruthless police force. And through this, you can show very clearly in a way that you didn't have to know a big, broad historical background to see who is in the right and who is in the wrong there. And so through the manipulation of really powerful media events, they were able to change and at least broaden the political narrative and the number of people paying attention to this issue. And it started to increase pressure on national politicians and eventually started to help to move towards some major changes in policy. So it was these manipulations of media events more than the innovations themselves that became the tools used by political outsiders. And I think that is a story that is something that we can see trend through time.
Right, because I think there's, if we look at this, the political communication cycle, as a technology becomes more stabilized, there's less, options to innovate. The kind of innovation window closes because people have already tried a bunch of things. And so when I was reading about the civil rights movement, I kept coming back to the Russian disinformation in the 2016 election, where
Sure.
it doesn't seem that they were necessarily innovating so much with the technology, but they were rather just manipulating the existing media that was already there. I mean, do you kind of see that connection?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I mean, I think that, it doesn't need to be something brand new to be disruptive or can change how we communicate or understand events. And in fact, the newest and most innovative tools are often the flashiest and sometimes get the most coverage, but almost by definition, they're not going to be used by as many people. So tried and true tools used in slightly different ways or thought about in slightly innovative fashion can actually be much more effective, right? We know that email, for instance, has been around for a very long time, is used by virtually everyone, is not something talked about really at all. But there have been innovations in how email has been used for fundraising or for spreading information that have actually been very effective. And I think that thinking about how the social media manipulation and disinformation efforts in the 2016 campaign were used is exactly along those lines. It's manipulating and using what was already done, but just using it in a slightly different way and really just stirring the pot that was, because it was used by almost everyone, it was almost impossible to see at the time until you sort of step back and view this. And I think that history can help make those examples clearer. Sometimes they're very hard to see when you're in the midst of it.
Yeah, definitely. And what I wanted to ask you about is looking at these different political communication orders, right? We've been talking about newspapers, television, internet, and I'm curious as to how you see these fitting together, because it's not like the radio comes along and people stop using newspapers. And
Right.
today we have a scenario where politicians are, they write op-eds in newspapers, they have radio ads, TV ads, internet ads. So they're sort of using all the medium. So it's not like one technology completely displaces the other for politics. I'm wondering how you see those political communication orders. I mean, do they kind of stack on top of each other, or kind of how do you see them relating to one another?
Yeah, I think that you're exactly right. Say in the book that these new technologies do not displace the other; they layer on top. And I could talk more about it, but I learned so much from Andrew Chadwick's work on the hybrid media system, and that's really what I think this is all about. It's so many of these new technologies that are working together and maybe in different ways. I describe in my classes how radio today hasn't disappeared, but it's also not used the same way. We don't sit around. Well, maybe we do a little bit more now with podcasting, but it's not. It's shifted in many cases to sort of radio culture, right? Because you're obviously not going to be watching TV while you drive. At least you shouldn't. That's a terrible idea. So the radio has shifted to car culture to a certain extent. And then as a result of that, well, it changed how news and other information is disseminated on the radio. But radio hasn't gone away. Radio is still incredibly important. And in fact, is maybe becoming more important as technology opens it up in new and different ways. So you have a layering and a changing of how some previous, more traditional mediums have been used, but they don't disappear, right? Newspapers shift online and TV becomes more on demand. But all of these things sort of layer on one another and blend together, because now you have the same actual device that you can listen to radio and watch TV and go on social media. So you have the devices actually merging, and the technology is sort of layering and blending together. So there is, broadly speaking, it's this hybrid media system that becomes increasingly complex, but only because they don't disappear, they layer on top of one another.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up podcasting, because that is my next question,
Absolutely.
which is, where do you see podcasting fitting into the kind of current information political communication order? Because it has similarities to radio, but it's distributed across mobile networks.
Yeah.
And we really see politicians really starting to adopt and experiment with it for campaigning, but also to communicate with constituents. So are we in the podcasting communication order?
I know, I feel like I am a podcasting junkie, and while I'm not an expert like you in making podcasts, and I think that I am so excited that you do this and that you do it so well. I think that podcasts offer a really remarkable, sort of next tier of what audio content can be. And it's essentially on-demand, interest-driven information, right? They can be serial, they can be, topic-based, but ultimately podcasts are still audio, but they're done in a way that is much more accessible. You don't need to be at a certain place at a certain time. You can listen, and because we are so connected and primarily listening through our phones, you can listen wherever you want to be, wherever you are, whenever you want. And so it's really more attuned to what Netflix has done to TV, podcast is doing to radio. And it's not that it's necessarily the same thing, right? Netflix feels a little bit different in some ways because you get a whole series together and you can watch those, you can binge watch those all you want. Podcasts are also, well, there's a few things that are really different, right? They're available online, but they're also available when you want them. And they're very personal. So one thing that's really beneficial of podcasts, and I think audio does this in a slightly different way than TV does, is that you're able to connect and listen to what is just for the people that are listening there. So a community can be created just around that podcast, or maybe around one particular cultural event or one particular community. And today, when we're living in this unusual environment where we can't interact face to face as much as we are used to, we can create community through these shared experiences. And I think that podcasts are a great example of what that can be and a great source of that. Do I think that it's an entirely new political communication order? I don't. I think that
No,
it's,
of course not.
of course not. But I also think that it's an important and really valuable new piece of what it can be, because having things that are interactive and, accessible whenever you want are one thing. But to be able to listen, I find myself able to understand, connect to information and to other people that are listening to the same things that I do through podcasts in a way that is different from watching cable news or watching clips on Instagram. They're different. And so while it's not a new order, it's an incredibly valuable addition to the one we're in.
Definitely, definitely. Well, Dr. Epstein, this has been fascinating to go back and check out all of these technologies and sort of, I think, really contextualize both historically, but also in terms of the factors at play that encourage political actors to adopt technology. So thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Michael. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the interest in the book. And really, I just appreciate how much thought you had. You had me thinking about this book in new and different ways. So I really appreciate it.
Glad to hear it. I've just been speaking with Dr. Ben Epstein, Associate Professor of Political Science at DePaul University. The book we've been discussing is called The Only Constant is Change: Technology, Political Communication, and Innovation Over Time. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be speaking with Stephen Smith, the former online engagement director for the Pete Buttigieg campaign. We'll talk about the Democratic primaries and some of the key trends in the social media space. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmo. See you next time.